This Week in Radio Tech, episode 151, is brought to you by Telos and the ProStream audio streaming encoder with built-in Omnia audio processing. Visit the Telos ProStream on the web at telos-systems.com/ProStream.
And now, our feature presentation.
Twert.
The British say stay calm and carry on. And now U.S. TV broadcasters have to do the same under the Calm Act. We hear about it next.
All right, calm down. He says that to everyone.
This calls for immediate discussion.
What's up, Doc?
All your days are belong to us.
From his palatial office of important business.
Or in a choice hotel in a distant land.
This is Kirk Harnack.
Chris Tobin joins me to chat with Tim Carroll, president of Linear Acoustic, about TV loudness and best practices.
You're dialed in to This Week in Radio Tech.
Hey, it's time for This Week in Radio Tech. I'm Kirk Harnack, your host. I'm so glad that you've joined us. This is the show where we talk about radio technology, mostly audio technology and RF technology, analog and digital RF technology, things that relate to getting typically audio programming out to the masses, the listeners, people who want to partake of this. And there's a lot of things about streaming, about traditional radio technology that we talk about. Tonight's show, we've got something pretty exciting. It has to do with audio, but not audio alone, not audio for radio. We'll get into that in just a minute. Our guest coming up is Tim Carroll on this episode number 151 of This Week in Radio Tech. First of all, let's bring in our other frequent co-host, the best-dressed engineer in radio from Manhattan, New York. It's my friend and yours, Chris Tobin. Hey, Chris.
Hello, Kirk. I'm doing well, and it's a great day in Manhattan. The weather was very fair, 47 degrees. It's quite unusual for this time of year. But then again, you're in Vegas, so you're having a good time, I would assume.
It's turning cold here in Vegas. The clouds are rolling in this afternoon, and a cold, cold wind blew in.
Oh, I'm sure it was, as you sat by the pool and enjoyed some adult beverages.
No, you're all right. No, you're all wrong. I'm serious. It's cold.
I've been in Vegas at this time of year. It's nice. It's cool. Still enjoyable.
It was pretty nice when I arrived here at McCarran International yesterday, but it really has turned cold. It's supposed to be cold tomorrow, too. But that's okay. CES is almost over, and I'll share a couple things about CES. Let's bring in, though, our guest, and not waste any time on anything else. Let's bring in Tim Carroll. Tim is the president of Linear Acoustic. Hey, Tim, how are you? Good evening.
Speaking of cold wind. Yeah, I'm good. Thanks, Kirk. How are you guys?
We're good. Glad to have you in here. Tim is actually a colleague of mine at the Telos Alliance. Tim founded, actually, and this company, Linear Acoustic, and then joined up with the Telos Alliance a few years ago. Tim, you're going to be talking to us about audio processing, but in your case, audio processing for television. And kind of give us a little foreshadowing of what we'll be learning on our show this evening.
Well, I think the one thing that is radically different is that processing for television it has different goals than processing for radio. There's an old joke that television without pictures is radio, but television without sound is surveillance. So the audio is important, but not in a soundscape sort of a way. We're not trying to paint a sound signature on a television station with processing. It's more for compliance. And processing has turned into a crutch to fix things that really should be fixed in other ways. So it is a bit different, and that was surprising for me to learn. My original background back to high school was radio, not television, and we used processing for a completely different reason.
Yeah. All right. Well, so you're going to be talking about the Calm Act that we've heard some things about, and just general public has heard about this, and certainly we in broadcasting have. And then, I'm excited to hear about what techniques that work well for television audio processing that makes the audio just seem natural and to go right along with the video that we're enjoying. What's bad is when the audio doesn't match the video in some way, and its tonality or its loudness or its softness loudness. So I'm excited to be hearing about that and starting to understand more about audio processing for television. Hey, our show is brought to you by the folks at the Telos Alliance, and specifically the Telos ProStream. We'll hear about that about halfway through the show. We'll take you on a little tour of the Telos ProStream. Well, it is CES week. It's been going on for the past 3 days, and let's see. I brought just a couple of things that I found at CES that might be worth our chatting about for a couple minutes here before we get into our hot topic. So I got time to go about through one half of one show floor at CES today. But one thing that I heard, I got caught a little wind of before CES, and then saw it today. We're going to start seeing Ubuntu on smartphones. At least I hope we are. That's going to be pretty interesting to see Ubuntu on smartphones. They're, if you've ever played with Linux, Ubuntu is a terrific release to play with, especially for guys like me who are, technically challenged just a bit. They got a lot of nice brochures about this. I'm sure you can go to the Ubuntu website and find out some of their what they have to offer to smartphone makers. So that'll be interesting. Chris, Tobin, you got any thoughts about Ubuntu on a smartphone as opposed to Android?
I think it's great. I enjoy the competition. There's more going on. Android, I find the implementation in various manufacturers is just sometimes annoying. I don't get the same experience with various brands. So the Ubuntu looks good. This is the skin. I saw a video from CES. I'm not sure if it was which booth had it, but somebody was showing the Ubuntu phone, and the interface looked good. The graphics look very nice, almost reminiscent of what looks like a Windows phone, or I guess Windows 8 Metro, that kind of thing. But it, why not? Let's see what happens. I'm a fan of opening it up because I'm really annoyed and tired of this having me locked into a phone and a carrier and their way of doing things, which is usually a crippled phone. I've got several phones that we use for audio purposes, and every one of them has a crippled audio subsystem because I didn't buy the particular carrier's audio or video service. Then when I get the same phone unlocked, did I say that? And then I use the same application software. Mysteriously, magically, it works very well.
Really? Isn't that?
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh,
Tim,
yeah. It's interesting, some of the things that they're doing.
Tim, are you the kind of guy that fiddles with your smartphone, or is it just an annoyance or a tool for you?
The smartphone, in general, the smartphone is an annoyance.
Okay.
No, I don't unlock. There are, not to defend the carriers, but there are things going on behind the scenes where the crippling, I think, is in some cases necessary to keep their networks from being crippled. It's not the ultimate answer, but this goes back to as Steve Church had a long conversation about this with a group of us, where he was saying that the common carrier backbone is never going to be able to support what the consumer wants to do, and I think day by day he's being proven more and more right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a finite amount of bandwidth, or it's not very elastic once we reach the boundaries of what our current technology can do. And they're turning on. Am I totally wrong? Are they turning on 1 million smartphones a day, or 1 million Android phones a day?
There's something like that that's been touted about.
Maybe on good days. No. There's another technology that I've seen at CES a few times that I just love this stuff. I've never played with it. And let me just tell you, where at some point we're going to be starting to buy Lego blocks for him. Have you priced Lego blocks? Well, I'm thinking that for less money, I can buy one of these and make my own Lego blocks. This is one of those 3D printers from MakerBot. And they were at their booth. They were printing up all kinds of cool things, 3D gear sculptures that worked. You ever play with one of these, Chris?
No, I haven't. But I did talk to someone who worked with a group. I think in Brooklyn. There's a MakerBot in Brooklyn, one of the companies, and it was pretty cool. I mean, you know what's even more fun is when you see this, and you read about it, and you watch the videos, and you sit back and you say to yourself, "Wow, just think, 20, 30 years ago." This was science fiction. Now it's reality.
Yeah.
It's so cool.
you're a bit limited in the sorts of things you can print. It's all made of this interesting material that's I guess still a bit malleable, slightly, and you know, and you've got to print it one little layer at a time. But they were printing up chess pieces on site. They were also printing up that interesting that kind of sculpture. You know, maybe you've seen an Escher print of where he takes a sculpture but like peels it, like a peeled sculpture. Well, they were printing stuff like that. So that's kind of it. Tim, we're going to print any linear acoustic processors with this, or is that still beyond the capabilities?
Well, I think actually there are some that are pretty affordable, and I think you'll see at least one in use at the Telos Alliance relatively soon. Kirk.
Oh, really? Oh.
Yes, sir. Because although that material is malleable, you know, we can form a mold around it, which becomes sort of like in LP pressing. So we make a positive and then a negative, and then we can fill that negative with material that's not quite as pliable.
Oh, there's an idea. Yeah, okay. That's an interesting idea.
It's a great way to test out injection molding before we, we have an actual mold constructed for $40,000 or $50,000. Make sure that it's right. Yeah, it's an amazing technology, and like Chris said, it's amazing that we're actually finally seeing this come to life.
Skipping back to audio here, whenever I go to any kind of show and I come across a booth where they have tube technology, I stop and salivate a little bit and I drool on their tube amplifiers. I just think this stuff is just so beautiful and so cool. And okay, these are pretty standard looking. You know, you see stuff like this, at various shows here and there. But then they had the versions for I guess your 90s and 2000s, your 90s children of the 90s, where they have a USB input on the tube amplifier and a couple little tubes there on top glowing. I think these would do about 12 watts at 1 kilohertz. And then they had some pretty ones where they were, brightly colored. And there's an SD card. So I guess you can play your MP3s through the tube. I'm not sure if that softens them up or makes them better or not. I just love that stuff.
I want to see an 833 tube. That's what I want to see. An 833 tube with USB.
They had some big honking tubes. I'm sorry, I don't know what. There were some 6 SN7s, I think.
Oh yeah, that's an audio tube. Yeah, 6SN7, very popular. 12AX7, that's another one.
That's a small tube.
I guess I should look at some of the.
Now that's a monster.
Ah, okay.
6L6, yeah, they were also metal tubes too. The glass ones were nice.
Unfortunately, their specs here don't mention the tubes that are in use. I would have had to pay more attention at the booth. Well, finally, I did stop somewhere related to radio. Got to stop at the HD radio booth and talk to Russ Munschenk. Those of you in the radio business are familiar with Russ. You know, he was a radio engineer, I believe, in Philadelphia for some time before he went over to Ubiquity. And I'll tell you what, when you walk into the HD radio booth at CES, the first thing you see are a Ford, a Chevy, and a Dodge. And they all come standard, or those models come standard with HD radio. And the list now of cars in which HD radio is either standard or available is pretty big. You know, it used to be just the Audis or the Lexus of the world, or maybe a Mercedes here. I don't know. But now, I mean, it Rolls-Royce, Ghost, and Phantom, sure. But there's a huge list of Toyotas that come with HD radio, or it's available. A huge list of Ford cars, BMWs, Mercedes, Cadillac, Chevrolet, Impala, the Silverado, and the Traverse. Some of these, yes, it is standard. The Chevy Traverse, HD is standard. And the Toyota Land Cruiser, it's standard. Okay, I guess it should be for the Land Cruiser price. A lot of Lexus models, it's standard. Whole bunch of and all of the Volvo models, it's standard. From the C30 up to the XC90. So my point is that, we're finally getting some traction on HD radio being out there. Now, whether or not people are listening, taking advantage of it, trying to tune into the channels between the channels, as they have often called it, I don't know. I don't know what the uptake is in terms of listeners, but in terms of being available in cars, it's there. And then there's this Next Radio project that we're going to do an interview with Paul Brenner in the coming weeks. Paul's going to come on and tell us about his experience and with Next Radio and what's available in some of that metadata technology, including the traffic data that I know the folks at Clear Channel have an agreement with Ubiquity to get and I think it was Garmin or Navtech. Maybe it's Navtech to get traffic data in all the metropolitan areas. So there's a lot going on there. It seems like most of my career we've been talking about the introduction of HD radio, and maybe it's finally somewhere. Chris, any comments on that and where you see HD radio's uptake in the marketplace, if at all?
Well, I'm still on the fence as far as where the HD radio is moving along. I still think broadcasters need to come out and do more with it, be more creative in offerings, and not just rehashing what they already have. And yeah, it's getting better. The choices, the metadata, I'll call it the metadata ancillary, features are starting to improve. But I have friends of mine in brand new cars that don't even have HD radio. They're XM, Sirius, everything else. Plenty of ports on the front of the dashboard to do everything but. So I'm not sure. I think broadcasters still need to be a little more creative. Like here in New York City, HD radio channels, HDs 2 and 3s. It's okay. Wow. Why would I bother? Why spend the money? I think that's what's hers. I hear that from a lot of folks who are not broadcasters.
Would you say that the programming that we have on HD radio, for the most part, is just not creative? It's just a lot of jukeboxes?
Yeah. I think the industry needs to wake up and realize that the jukebox approach still is not the way to go anymore. Since we have so many options, we need to be more creative. Think back in the days of the 30s, 40s, and then when there was a small period of time, 60s and 70s, when radio was playing music, but what was between the records. And I think that's what we need to get back to. Because if you notice, a lot of cable stations, or I'll call them that, cable stations that have programs that have a following that's, people that follow these shows religiously, if you want to call it that, with passion. If you notice, a lot of these cable channels are very creative in what they present and how they're doing it. And then when they muck it up by adding too many commercials, too many breaks, and disrupting that flow, how fast it drops. Radio's been in that boat now for 20 years and no one's paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you have a format that's perishable, then you're lucky and you're the only one in town, you'll be fine. But if you're one of 7 music stations in a market and you're the same owner, you can't skin the cat that many times and make money off it.
Tim, you reside in a relatively rural area, not a big market. Is there HD radio? Or is there any interest where you are in HD radio?
There is some HD radio on the air.
Mm-hmm.
My personal interest, I really thought it was going to be something pretty special for AM, as the audio bandwidth kept getting ratcheted further and further back. The blend from a marginal AM signal to the HD radio version was pretty impressive. Mm-hmm. The blend inside of FM, in my opinion, in a system that's using the whole available data rate for the audio, the codec isn't really stressed. But when you slice this up into HD2 and HD3, it really pushes on that quality bar, and it's not pushing it up. I'd love to say that maybe that's why there isn't the kind of interest that people were expecting, but then I tune into some of the services that come from geosynchronous and non-geosynchronous space, and that argument goes right the heck out the window.
Where's the quality there? Where's the audio quality? Some of the content's pretty good, but
you know where the quality is, Kirk? The quality is going back to standard FM. That's where the quality
radios
is.
Yeah. Actually, Tim, I'm glad you mentioned about AM. I also heard from Russ Munchak today that they had been testing an all-digital AM HD station, and he told me where, and I'm sorry now, I'm forgetting, but it was in the expanded part of the dial. It was like 1660 on the dial at 10 kilowatts, all digital, no hybrid operation, no analog. Just all digital HD, where they were able to get real strength and substance in the carriers there, and they carried it 45 miles. in full a full quality. I'm sorry, I don't know what the bit rate was on the codec, but obviously it can be higher than under the current hybrid AM model, and they were pretty excited about it. But of course, doing that, you obliterate all of the analog AM radio use. You have to have an HD radio for that. So hey, we'll get Russ or someone else from Ubiquity on the show within the next few weeks, and we'll get an update on that. Well, we've kind of gotten a couple highlights from CES and given a few thoughts on those things. Let's move into the meat and potatoes of this episode, and that's why we brought Tim Carroll from Linear Acoustic on, and I'm glad he agreed to be on. You know, in the news about TV audio processing lately has been this CALM Act. We heard about it, I guess, a couple, 3 years ago when it was proposed, and it was passed, and now it's gone into effect, and stations have to comply with it. I don't know if that means all terrestrial TV stations or if that means all cable channels as well. And so maybe, Tim, you could tell us something about whatever order you want to. I'm also interested in hearing about some of your philosophy on audio processing for what is often dialogue with just a little bit of music. It's different than what we're used to in radio when you're processing audio for television. So, Tim, maybe you could kind of bring us into this subject of the CALM Act, however you like to. Where do you want to start?
Well, let's start with the ATSC, the Advanced Television Systems Committee. We've participated within the ATSC. We're a sponsor of the organization. And that's the group that created the DTV standard for the U.S. and Mexico and Canada, South Korea. And it's the system that uses MPEG-2 video and AC3 or Dolby Digital audio. CALM is sort of the culmination of several years of work. You might find this hard to believe, but the rules for consistent audio have been on the books for digital television since 1995.
Oh my goodness.
That's 17 years, and that's how long they've been in the Code of Federal Regulations. So CALM really was a method to compel the FCC to start enforcing something, and that was the problem with the original text from the bill that Anna Eshoo in California introduced. Well-intentioned. Like with any regulation, it tends to have effects that people might not be expecting. And if anybody was looking for a cure-all for television loudness problems, certainly a piece of legislation, even though it passed unanimously through all of Congress, the CALM Act isn't it. It's just sort of the pointy edge of the arrow. It gives a little bit of meat to rules that were in existence. And in fact, the ATSC was already 2 years into a project creating what today is known as A85. A85 is a recommended practice for how to achieve loudness consistency. And what CALM did was essentially turn that recommended practice. CALM compelled the FCC, who wrote a report and order, and the report and order turned that recommended practice into the technical basis for how to achieve loudness consistency. It's between the report and order, which is probably a 70-plus page document, and A85, which is close to a 70-page document. It's a lot to digest. It's a lot more complex than at least the details of how to achieve this can be a lot more complex than might be apparent. But CALM is actually very simple. It can all be boiled down to something that everybody that is responsible for delivering a signal via television to consumers, and this includes licensed broadcasters. Low-power television has a little way to go before they're covered by this. It covers cable and it covers satellite. So nobody is really off the hook here. What it is essentially telling them to do is to not upset the viewers. It seems ridiculous how simple that is, but that's what it comes down to. If you boil it down to its essence, what they say is, the FCC, we won't do anything unless we see repeated complaints. So if you're not getting complaints, you're compliant. Sounds amazing, doesn't it?
You know, that sounds, the way you describe that, Tim, sounds like a pretty effective way to write a rule or a piece of legislation or an act. Do you find that you're in that you find this agreeable? What's written?
Well, I mean, just like any rule that is that simple but then takes 70 pages to explain it, you can imagine that there's going to be some discussion about it. I think probably every broadcaster could agree that there's at least one person in their audience that's gunning for them. Mm-hmm. There's somebody that's going to complain, somebody that wants to come by and look at the public file, just to look at the public access file.
Yeah.
Somebody that's going to complain that closed captioning isn't working. There's going to be a complainer. That is more of an issue than anything else. But the FCC got smart there, too. They're not going to accept, Mary Jones from Keokuk, Iowa, calling 37 times to complain. They're going to see a pattern of a problem here, but it's probably not with the station if she's the only one complaining. Not to pick on any specific Mary Jones in lovely downtown Keokuk, Iowa. But you can see that, like with any report and order, any part of the Code of Federal Regulations, when I was in college, one of the things that we tried to really interpret was Part 15. How do you deal with low power? What do they really mean? Well, I can read this rule 6 different ways. And unfortunately, with the actual report and order, you can read some of the technical details both ways. One page says, well, if you put a processor in, you're compliant. Another page says, but some people in the industry, and we know which part of the industry is saying this, have said that just processing might result in audio that has been affected too much. Mm-hmm. So, page after page, it goes back and forth and back and forth. But you can't misinterpret, don't upset the audience. It's wonderfully simple. So now the interpretation comes out. Well, what's going to make an audience happy? Is it audio that is extremely consistent, but it's very consistent because it's been heavily processed? Mm-hmm. Is that going to make people happy? In certain parts of the country, absolutely. And it's not a statement about anything other than, is television being watched actively? Are there home theater systems set up where people are expecting to hear DVD quality and DVD dynamics from a television station? Or have they given up on ever getting that from broadcast? So the question gets a little bit more complex, and this is where stations begin to interpret things a bit differently. Quality is not the same as compliance. So, being strictly compliant by the letter of the law may not exactly, or even the spirit of the law, may not exactly deliver to the viewers what the station wants to deliver to the viewers. But this is where the technical stuff gets a little complex. How do you deliver a very wide program, something that has lots of dynamics in it, a major action-adventure movie, where the range between the quietest and the softest might be, on the DVD, it might be 60 or 80 dB. That's a gigantic range, even for a moderately quiet living room, which is probably looking for closer to maybe 20 dB maximum. How do you deliver that to those people that want that kind of range, and yet still satisfy the television set that's hanging in the corner grocery store that's, coming out of an ever-shrinking speaker? I mean, I'm holding my hand up. This is probably being really, really generous these days.
Yeah.
So it's complicated. It's...
just now, Tim, on the challenges of television processing. And what I'd like to do is understand that a bit better, what the challenges are. And I know it's very program dependent. I mean, if you're an affiliate replaying The Price is Right, well, you've got crowd noise and people yelling and the announcer going and some music all the time. And, that seems pretty consistent. But if you're playing a show that's very dramatic and you want to keep that dramatic feel, the sound of the dialogue, any music effect, any natural sounds, all that kind of thing, and then maybe a narrator would come on, like Alistair Cook, to explain, what to set it up or explain what's going on. That's right. So what are the challenges, the most typical challenge that people will face in providing consistent and proper audio for the type of program that's being presented?
Well, I think if there was a specific genre for a television station, that would make things easier. I can think of a good example that occurred during the Olympics. We had the luxury. I was in London with assisting NBC, and we had the luxury of being able to hear the actual over-the-air broadcast from some of the cable networks and from WNBC in New York. So the encoded video and audio came back to us, and we were able to modulate it and run it into a television set and actually hear what a consumer might hear. And it's interesting. In Vancouver, we found that at least one of the cable networks, the processing had been tuned for a financial talk show, and you can understand the reluctance of changing that processing on a successful, cable network for a few hours of Olympic programming per night, and then for the weekend as well. So what you had was processing that was really tuned for a single mic and occasional music and commercials, but fairly aggressive processing to keep that talk audio very consistent. Run figure skating into that, and all of a sudden you hear the heartbeat of the figure skaters and the announcers digesting dinner. It was tough to listen to. So we spent a lot of time working with NBC to retune the processing so that, a lot happened between Vancouver and London. It's a little more than 2 years. That was at the heart of the broadcasters, actually, even without the help of comm. The major broadcasters, the major networks, were getting in and improving consistency of their programming. And so really what that meant is they could back the processing down significantly. So we spent time pulling that processing back, and what we ended up with is something that for the financial broadcast, they were doing additional processing in the mixing console. So the processing existed either across the mix bus or in the channel strip. Mm-hmm. The transmission processing was there more as protection and looking out for commercials that might be too loud. And it pretty much left the audio that was coming from London unprocessed. It applied only a light degree of processing, and it worked really well. But that was 2 years of work to make that happen. So the industry, I think, has dramatically improved since somebody got a bee in their bonnet about passing legislation saying that the broadcast industry needs to make this better. They were well into this, several years into this, by the time that legislation ever even passed the president's desk. By that time, consistency had improved a great deal. Things aren't perfect. Television distribution is complicated. You have a situation where a service, let's say like HBO, that's fully under the control of HBO. They control every second of that programming, whether it's delivered over cable or satellite. They control the interstitials that are inserted. There are no commercials inserted downstream. That makes it easier in that case. And actually, the way the rules are written, it gives any broadcaster or multiple system operator who's carrying HBO the ability to say, well, HBO, you need to certify that this stream is correct. Because if we're ever asked about it, we're going to point directly back at you. And so that's something that's sort of unique about the way the FCC decided to write the report and order. They've really tried not to burden the end broadcaster. If they can show that what's being delivered to them, they can get a letter saying, we're certifying this audio is compliant, they're a little bit off the hook. I wouldn't say totally, because if they insert commercials, all bets are off. They have to guarantee that that insertion's not going to cause, again, not going to cause viewer complaints. So a little bit of a twist in things, but still the goal is still that simple rule. Don't upset the viewer.
Wow. Hey, this has been a great introduction to this, and I'm eager to hear the second half of Tim's explanation of how they are solving the audio issues and making things not only compliant, but really making sure that they sound good as often as possible, if not all the time, and where those pieces of equipment go, where do corrections go. You're watching or listening to This Week in Radio Tech. I'm Kirk Harnack, your host. This is episode number 151, and we're here along with Chris Tobin from New York City, former radio engineer and now head of the guys over at Musicam USA. So they're here. And also our guest today is Tim Carroll with Linear Acoustic, known for their television audio processors. And so we're learning about compliance with the CALM Act. Our show is brought to you by Telos, the Telos Alliance, and specifically this episode is brought to you by the Telos ProStream. What is the ProStream, and why would you pay $2,000 for it when you can do what it does for less money yourself? Well, we get asked that question sometimes. If you really enjoy playing with computers, and if you really enjoy keeping operating systems up to date and dealing with disk crashes and all that kind of thing, cooling issues, fans and all that, well, you can do audio processing and stream encoding with a PC. And a lot of folks do that. In fact, at my radio stations, I do that. In fact, we use a piece of software called Omnia AXE to make it convenient and consistent. But the Telos ProStream is an appliance. It's an audio processing and stream encoding appliance. It also lets you insert metadata from your automation system, or maybe you have some software that collects and curates metadata from various sources and schedules metadata to be put along with your stream. So the ProStream can do that. The ProStream from Telos is a one rack unit, little box. It's slim, it's compact, it doesn't require much power. And you turn it on, you boot it up, you dial in, you give it an IP address, and you tell it an IP address of where it's supposed to send your stream, and you can then select any number of different audio encoding algorithms. A lot of folks are turning to a derivative of AAC called HEAAC V2. This is a very popular algorithm because all the smartphones will listen to this. Lots of other devices like iPads and Android tablets and computers, of course, will decode and listen to this kind of coding. And it sounds really good at low bit rates. And if you're transmitting across cellular phone networks and 3G and 4G networks, well, that's the kind of bit rate that you want. You want a low bit rate that sounds good. Well, if you pre-process this audio using Omnia's AX processing, again, that's built into the ProStream, then you get audio that is properly configured, properly positioned for the encoder. The Omnia processing inside consists of a wideband input AGC, then a 3-band compressor, and then a look-ahead limiter that's been very finely tuned and designed to not have any audio artifacts that look-ahead limiters can have. So the Omnia AX processor is in there. The audio then goes to be encoded, and the newest versions of software for the for the Telos ProStream can do 2 encoders at the same time. So you can encode one stream in, let's say, MP3 at 128 kilobits, if you like, and another stream at HEAAC at 56 kilobits. Now, after these streams are encoded, you can also send them out to different replication servers. So if you want to have geographically diverse replication servers, you can do that. You can also serve a few streams out of the Telos Pro Stream itself, for confidence monitoring, checking it from various places. But it's not meant for, thousands of people to log into. It's not that kind of product. That's what a replication server will do. You can also take the Telos Pro Stream and send its stream to any one of a number of different services like Live 365, like Stream On, and you can use your own server like with Shoutcast or Icecast. So all these possibilities are there. Lots of broadcasters are using Pro Streams, and we'd like you to check it out too. Check out the website. It's at telos-systems.com. That's telos-systems.com. You can go right to it by adding a /ProStream. telos-systems.com/ProStream. Check it out on the web. Our guest, Tim Carroll, is describing for television. And Tim, thanks for hanging through the commercial break. Let's hear more about processing and fixing problems in television audio and how we're getting that done.
Well, here's something that might be also a little bit surprising. It turns out that loudness issues and dynamic range are related, but they are two separate things. And the systems for digital television, specifically Dolby Digital, want to keep them as two separate things. And it's important. So think about this. If you notice, most DVDs, and you may not notice this, most DVDs are encoded and they've got a loudness value that is tagged to them. It's part of metadata. You've mentioned metadata before, so it's data about the audio data. Dolby Digital has metadata built in. One specific parameter called dial norm. It's essentially a pointer towards what the average loudness of that program is. And it's nothing more than that. So the range is from -1 to -31, so it's a 30 dB range. It's essentially telling you, and the consumer decoder, what the average loudness of that audio is. So -31 would be pretty quiet. -4 would be pretty loud. And it's used by the consumer decoder to apply the inverse. So simply put, the target level for consumers, for the consumer decoder, is -31 dB full scale. So think about it this way. If you have a program whose loudness averages at -31, that's the dial norm value you put in, no attenuation is applied. If you have a program that's louder at -21, and that's the dial norm value that you enter, then 10 dB of attenuation is applied. It's a fixed 10 dB shift. Doesn't affect dynamic range, doesn't affect signal-to-noise ratio. The system can easily handle this. But what it allows is on a content-by-content basis, from one piece of content to the next, you could actually apply this value. So content A has a value of 31. Content B has a value of 21. Content C is -11. So it's going to apply in 1 dB steps, and it happens on almost a video frame boundary, once every 32 milliseconds, 33 milliseconds, sorry. No, take that back, 32 milliseconds. Dolby E is 33 milliseconds.
Okay.
It's a lot. So it's very fast, and it will window that change. So if it has to do 10 dB of change, it'll do an instantaneous change. There won't be any clicking or popping. What's interesting is that if you were to grab a bunch of DVDs that represented movies done in the last 10 or 15 years, you would find that the average loudness of those DVDs was within about 4 dB. That's amazingly close. And I'll tell you from having worked on the film stages why that is. When we calibrate a film stage at Dolby, we would put pink noise through the speakers, and we would measure either using an expensive Larson-Davis meter, a loudness meter, an SPL meter, or a very inexpensive Radio Shack meter, which ended up setting more Academy Award-winning stages than any of the really expensive stuff.
Wow, okay.
It's amazing. As long as you didn't drop it on its head, which completely killed the low-frequency response, these things work pretty good. So we'd use this very expensive B&K calibrator. You could have bought probably 30 loudness meters for the cost of this calibrator, and we'd check all the SPL meters. By calibrating that room so that on the console, 0 VU or minus 20 dB full scale was actually putting out pink noise that was 85 dB C-weighted slow. So C-weighted and slow response, so the meters we're actually integrating. The amazing thing is this was happening for decades. This has gone on. That integration is what became the basis for loudness metering. So without even knowing it, we weren't actually making an electrical measurement. I mean, obviously we knew we weren't making an electrical measurement. We were making an acoustic measurement that, because it was C-weighted and it was slow response, it was semi-integrating. We were calibrating the stages for loudness. Okay. That's why all these mixes ended up within 4 dB. What's interesting about that is that typical human hearing from person to person varies by about 4 dB. Pretty amazing. Now, this is important because while this is true on film stages, it's not at all true or hadn't been true in television post-production. So you post-produce in TV, in general, people were setting the monitors any level they wanted. So it doesn't matter that the dialogue was hitting 0 VU or minus 20 dB full scale. Some mixers would like to hear that loud. Some would like to hear it soft. Remarkably, though, most television content, at least long form, and even some shorter sitcoms, were also only within a few dB of each other, much louder than film. So film, that 4 dB was somewhere between minus 27 and minus 31. Television mixes were closer to minus 20. And that sort of makes sense. So how it happened is still, I'm pausing because it's an amazing thing. It's certainly not describing everything, but at least overall loudness. And so by overall, what we mean is we're measuring a piece of content for the length of that content. We're not interested in instantaneous values because that's dynamic range. We're interested in what is the average level of that content, and we focus on dialogue. It's a good anchor element. Now, not everything has dialogue, that's true. So, for an all-music program, you would want to make that fit into surrounding programs that might have dialogue. But most television has dialogue in it. So dialogue becomes a great anchor. And so what we're interested in is what is the average level of that dialogue for that program. That anchor is the point at which we have dynamic range around it. So the gunfight will get louder. The death scene will get quieter. That dynamic range shouldn't be mistaken for the loudness of the program. Now here's where things get mushed together. You can use a dynamic range processor, so a standard multiband or wideband processor, to turn the gain down when the audio is loud and turn the gain up when the audio is quiet. So essentially, if the dialogue is the anchor and the program is mixed so that there's, at any given moment, an equal amount of loud and soft around that center, reducing the dynamic range allows you to create this nice dense package, which you can then park at some loudness value and broadcast it that way. So we've just solved loudness problems. If we run everything through this sausage machine that controls the dynamic range and keeps it around that center, we don't have loudness problems. The problem with that is we also don't have dynamic range.
Yeah.
And
It sounds
that
like it from
becomes an issue.
broadcasting.
You know, it works for music, which sadly, at least with a lot of what's being mastered today, doesn't start with much dynamic range. But it's different when you've got long pauses in the audio, when you've got, as you mentioned before, Kurt, dialogue and crowd noise behind it. You really don't want the crowd noise and the dialogue to be at equal levels. You don't want the crickets to be at the same loudness as the announcer's voice in golf. And you certainly don't want the crickets brought up until somebody swings the club and then the crickets get dropped through the floor. That's when you start to hear, pumping and breathing.
Yeah.
It's these long gaps that are a problem. So what do we do? That's been the drive in the industry for really since the beginning of introducing Dolby Digital into broadcast. It was easy in film. Again, with all of that content already being pretty much correct, there wasn't a whole heck of a lot of work to do there. But with broadcast, it was everything, and everything had to be gotten correct from day one. Now, there's no doubt, by and large, commercials are louder than surrounding content. Not always, but a lot. So, as metering was developed, we have a thing called the ITU standard. It's called ITU-R BS 1770. It's actually a relatively short document. Unlike the other two, which are lengthy and not recommended right before bedtime, BS 1770 is it's a technical read, but it's really not too bad. Essentially, it describes how to measure loudness in a standardized way. We're up to revision 3, and within that document, what it talks about is measuring over the length of a program. So you're storing these values, you're making readings every 400 milliseconds and storing these values into this integrator. So for a 30-minute program, you store 30 minutes worth of values. And at the end of that, you get a number that tells you what the average was. Now, you can imagine that a 30-minute average, the first 30 seconds are going to do a lot. The last 30 seconds, even if it was a near full-scale explosion, probably aren't going to move that meter by very much. But it is going to give you an average that agrees with what human listeners determined the average to be. And as these things always seem to work out, the beginning of the ITU process, there were a whole bunch of very complicated meters and some super simple meters that got submitted for consideration. And it's probably not going to surprise you to know that the very simplest meter is the one that was the most accurate.
Wow.
The ones that tried to outsmart the listener, there was always some piece of content that would cause the algorithm to fail. So what can we do with these meters? If you're mixing live, you can look at the meter and make sure that your loudness is consistent. This is what we did at the Olympics, and it's what will continue to be done at the Olympics. Didn't replace the mixers meters that they're used to, didn't replace a VU meter or a PPM meter or even straight peak meters. It's in addition to that metering. It just kind of lets you know where you're at. And for that, for live mixing, obviously we don't want to set the integration to infinite because, again, 30 minutes into water polo, that meter's not going to be moving anymore. So we set the integrator to be faster, so 10 seconds. And it's very much like a speedometer. Hopefully, you're not driving the car looking at the speedometer like this. You're hopefully, driving the car and glancing at the speedometer every now and then. And that's exactly how a loudness meter for live content should be used. Now, content like commercials, we can actually use automated processes that will, in fact, measure the entire piece of content and come up with a number. And then we can also use an automated process. This can all happen faster than real time. There's tons of tools out there. We have some, along with Wohler. Dolby has some. There's tons of tools available. And you can then scale that content. So if your broadcast target is, let's say, -24, you can align all of your adverts and your short and long form programming to that -24. And it doesn't do it by compressing.
Mm-hmm.
It does it by measuring, finding the average, and then scaling the whole thing.
Wow.
So what we've done, though, Kirk, is we've now gotten loudness consistent, but we can still have that gunfight, which could be lots of dynamic range, probably too much.
Yeah.
We can also, and this is the tough part, we think of this. We could have a commercial that measures perfectly at -24. We can have a wide dynamic range 15-minute segment of, let's say, a hospital drama, because there's 8 trillion of those on television. Right? Mm-hmm. The average, we can line those averages up so that on average, the dialogue in the commercial and the dialogue in the long-form content are correct. Now, the problem is that at the end of that 30-minute segment, the dialogue gets quiet. Somebody's in bed, they're going to pass away, it's a horrible thing, the doctors are whispering, and then all of a sudden, you hit this commercial, which is correct, but you've got a 6 or 8 or 9 dB difference in loudness. Now, psychologically, that's not the same as hearing a gunshot. You see the gun go off, you expect a 6 or 8 dB, maybe even more, change in level.
Sure. Yeah.
After a death scene, no matter how well-intentioned that shampoo commercial is, a 6 or 8 dB jump is going to be annoying. Mm-hmm. And you're going to be on the FCC website trying to see how to complain. It's annoying. What we have is no longer a loudness problem, it's a dynamic range problem. But now, how do we solve dynamic range problems without permanently altering the content? Because if we do it that way for services that have advertisements inserted, what about the services that broadcast movies, who also would have perhaps an extended section of loud content that would need to be brought under control? How do we do that without doing it permanently? And how do we have that movie channel coexist on the same cable or satellite service that a broadcaster that is also inserting commercials has to exist on? And the answer actually comes back to metadata. And again, metadata is as old as the rules on the books, at least for Dolby Digital. It's, more than 17 years old at this point, and it probably hasn't been used to its best advantage. But that metadata can actually control dynamic range without touching loudness. Remember, loudness is dial norm. Dynamic range control is dynamic range control. So there are ways to do this. And as an industry, now that we understand, I think broadcasters understand in general what the problem is and how to improve things, now the focus is shifting to how do we do this and not completely throw away the quality? I told you it was complex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm kind of at the cliff here. How do we do that? I suppose the answer's coming.
Well, you could do like the FM and music stations did over the years. You can buy Selector and program your commercials that have loud intros with a certain category and soft intros, and match them up with the programs when you come out of the program segment. You could do it that way, like they used to do with jingles and things of that sort. Or you can sort of educate the TV industry to find a way to stop too much AGC along the downstream side. If you're not on HBO, that is, you're lucky to have end-to-end. But I have a loudness meter set up on my TV with my cable service, and it's amazing the amount of difference, as Tim points out, between dynamic range and everything else, or just loudness or what people perceive. But then there are some channels that are just loud. I mean, literally, you go from channel to channel and everything's just loud. It's interesting. And yet there are programs that are produced, Hollywood shows, that are perfect. As Tim points out, is ideal. It's exactly what you see. I look at the, whether it be the 1770 reading, what is it, the LKF, LKFS, and then VU, PPM, reconstructed peaks, the whole bit. And you're like, wow, it's great. Then they go into a commercial, and you can look on a scope, and that commercial is quite dense. And I don't think it's because it's just loud. It's like the typical, we're processing it with something. It's going to be interesting. And just as a side note, Tim's presentation at the SMPTE meeting in New York City at 30 Rockefeller Center last year touched on this, and the folks from Fox and NBC and a few other networks talked about the difficulties, as Tim pointed out, of the complexity of, I'll just call it, television distribution, and how it's not as simple. And Tim's right; it's going to be a very, very difficult path to travel down to find ways to, but makes perceived loudness, and dynamic range, dial norm, who's picking what, who's doing what right and wrong, and then going from there. So I think I have that sort of in general terms, right, Tim?
I think so. Yep, you're right.
So I'm kind of good at understanding a bit about this metadata and describing the loudness of a program or a commercial, but I'm not clear at all, and I hope you're going to clear me up here. What happens if at the transition point of these two things, when the program doesn't know anything about the commercial that's coming up, and the commercial knows nothing about the program that just preceded it? What happens at that inflection point?
That's the problem. That's what the FM and AM stations have had for years, between segments and programs. When I worked at two networks,
they just compress and limit the hell out of everything, but that's not what we want to do with television, is it?
Yeah, no, I know that, but when I was working with some programmers, they would sit in the program is called Selector. Is if you're in FM music or AM music stations, right. Selector is the de facto program, and I would sit with these guys and ask them, "Oh, how do you know this?" Well, what you do is you got categories. So this particular song, artist, whatever, is in a category we consider loud in, soft out, or soft in, loud out. So then I program it so that anything following that will be the reverse or not reverse, complemented. And that way I can transition from commercial breaks in and out softly or hard. Because I worked at stations that were hot ACs, and then I worked for the soft AC or easy listening stations, so you can't have anything too loud at all. And it was interesting when you did it right, and it took hours of programming. I mean, the PD, the program director, would sit there and go through every song in the library and then find out which commercials, and tell production, when you produce commercials, this is the code I want you to use for loud in, or loud or soft out, or whatever it is, and then he would take those codes and match them up to his music categories. And when it was right, it did exactly as Tim pointed out. TV should sound, where the dynamic range was where it should be, loudness is where it should be, and the perceived reception, or the audio to the listener, was comfortable. There was no annoyance. But to do that in television, and the nice thing is TV has the metadata capability. You still have to have somebody say, okay, this is a show called Gossip Girl, and at this break at 10:30, we're going to have a break. The commercial starts off is going to be a loud intro, but that segment coming out of Gossip Girl is soft. Who dictates which way and how is that going to be interpreted? Because that's really what it comes down to.
I'm guessing that doesn't happen at all. I mean, I'm guessing, in radio, as I mentioned earlier, the TV program has no knowledge of what commercial is coming after it, and vice versa.
Right.
In radio, what you just described, Chris, is a wonderful situation where you can get that feedback loop going, and you have an idea of the characterization of the beginning and end of these various segments, songs and commercials.
Right.
And I'm impressed that you had PDs that would do that. I didn't work with PDs that would. I mean, they try to keep two female singers from back to back or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
Silly things that they would do. But this loudness issue, loud and soft. Now, and sure, we did this with jingles. Yeah, you'd come out of a quiet song that ended quietly. And you had a jingle at that point. Sure, you'd pick the jingle that begins slowly and quietly and then builds up and exits onto to the next fast song. But of course, that's what I want to know about from Tim is what do we do in television? Is it like that there's not foreknowledge of the next commercial coming up, or we just have to deal with what comes down the pike on the fly?
Well, I think it's a good question, and I think it is possible to do that. The automation systems are massive for television. They're describing video events and audio events, and are there fields for that? Absolutely. Is there staff that can take the time to do this? Probably not. But the thing that unfortunately kills this is if you have a network broadcast. So let's pick a station. Let's make a station up, WXGQ in New York, and they're carrying a network broadcast. And let's say the network has certified that what they're delivering is consistent. So you know from 8 p.m. until 11 p.m. That you have audio that will be compliant. And if it's not, it's really the network's fault. That's only partially true because during that time, there's also local avails where local commercials will be inserted. But still, that's not a daunting problem. A programmer could sit down and analyze the programming that the commercials are going into. It's really traffic that decides what gets played when for, myriad reasons. The order is done in the order it's done in. But could it be done? Absolutely, between 8 and 11. And then before 8 and after 11, you could day part the processing to apply more aggressive dynamic range control. But here's where this comes apart. When you step outside of the HBOs and the Cinemaxes and outside of a local broadcaster that has those controls and go to a cable network, and it's not fair to call it a cable network, but a network from an MVPD, a multiple video program distributor. They have control over that to a point, but those local avails are completely blindly inserted. There's one cable system that manages all of this out of Texas, and they are distributing the commercials out to head ends over broadband networks because their business is broadband. So they're able to get these commercials out to local insertion servers that are inserting them into that program stream. Now, they have absolutely no idea what they're inserting into. And even if that piece of commercial content is pre-encoded correctly, you're right. What do we know about the beginning of that commercial and the end of that program that it's going to be inserted into? So that's where it becomes something that's beyond automation. They wouldn't have that feedback from the MVPD to know what they're inserting into. And that's where straight scaling, where, again, we're matching averages, the averages can be made to work out. It's these boundary issues and the dynamic range within a program that require dynamic range control. So, you asked about a solution. I think if the industry does part of this and gets the averages matched, and then we end up with interstitial issues, so the boundary issues that our measurements have shown are probably 6 dB, maybe 9 dB maximum. There are things that we can do to improve that, and we can do it in the metadata domain. So that means that we're not actually touching the original programming. We can make a change like that. So we do have the ability. Remember that video encoding, as you guys have experienced, certainly with the things you do on this network, video encoding takes time. And it takes time if the bit rate has to be extremely low, and it also takes time if the bit rate is higher, but you want the quality to also be as good as it can be. So some MPEG-2 encoding can take, seconds. The earliest stuff was many seconds. Certainly it can happen faster than that today, but why not put that time to use? Why not put other delays to use? Why not build systems that really look at more of the programming? Now, there's a limit. Somebody said, well, if you could look at 30 minutes worth of programming, you could decide what to do. Well, it turns out you actually can't do it any better than looking very closely at the last, under a second's worth of audio. You can sort of tell what's coming and where it's going. Are there solutions to this? Yeah, absolutely. The thing that we're up against, though, Kirk, is that the easiest thing to do is to process and over-process. It's cheap.
Yeah.
It doesn't require an insurance plan or benefits. It's there on Christmas Eve without complaint. It just runs and runs and runs. And man, that is really, as a processing manufacturer, I feel disingenuous saying, yeah, but that's not really the best answer. But it's not, because of metadata, and because of a metadata system that is built into every single consumer decoder. They all have it. There is no question that it exists. Unlike, I have to say, some HEAAC decoders where metadata is actually optional, there are only certain devices where you can guarantee that it's present, and we've gone through this with mobile television, but that's for another episode. I can say with certainty that every Dolby Digital and Dolby Digital Plus decoder out there has functioning metadata capability in it, and they all react the same way. So I think what you're going to see, at least from us, is more of a shift towards focusing on what we can get done in the metadata domain and leave the original audio alone.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree. I think Tim's got it hit the nail on the head, if you will, and that is you don't have control of boundaries, absolutely, and the insertion. I mean, I could hear it on my cable service or MVPDS, and it's obvious that it's the processing that's being used as the catch basin to keep things somewhat in check, so that maybe they don't get a phone call or the website doesn't become active now that the COM Act is running wild. But I think processing you're going to have to do just do it properly. The old saying, it's subjective, but I think if the industry could find a way, content provide program originators and folks like that, maybe if you pushed or developed procedures, policies that could help folks that produce this product to keep it within the range, as Tim pointed out. If we had certain boundary of the audio spectrum and where things are, so when it's mismatched, it's close. It's not exactly on target, but it's at least close enough that it may not upset the person sitting on the couch and all of a sudden find themselves, go, oh, what was that? I could say, working at several radio stations, and one in particular, I worked with the production staff. We came up with believe it or not, it's basically like it's like the A85 and all this stuff. Coming up with dial normal. We actually came up with a certain threshold for all recordings at the radio station for spots, and by doing that, we were able to stay within a certain boundary. So when we got agency spots in, from the ad agencies that we didn't produce, but national ads, which were all over the place, we could just run it through. We knew the metering we had. We used peak metering based not on 1770, but close. And the guys in production would just bring it down, put it where it needed to be, put it into automation system, and no matter where that commercial wound up within the network of stations we had, the audio on the air, depending on where it played, would be really close. On some stations we had it was right on the money, others it was a little off, but no more than maybe 2 or 3 dB, maybe 4 at best. Yeah. So it worked. Took a lot of work, yes. The staff in place did do it, but the policy came down from the top, and over time, everything became very consistent. All of a sudden, people started to notice. When our station, certain sound on the radio that was like, wow, no matter what happens, it's always consistent. When they compared it to the others, it was sort of like all over the place. And it was the same spot being played. So we had clients even saying, wait a minute, this stuff sounds better on your radio station than it does on the other guys I bought time on. What's that about? It took time for that to suddenly develop, but TV could... people are in place. There are production facilities. And then it follows. I've worked with some editors that I said, well, the audio seems kind of low. No, it's not. Look, the metering is fine. It's perfect. I'm like, okay, whatever you say. And then the finished product, it's like all over the place. Nobody seemed to care. So I don't know. Maybe that's another approach, because I don't think you'll ever be able to get the metadata to match up the way we'd like it to. Would be nice, but you're right. There's no healthcare and no holiday work that hours to worry about with the other box.
I'm not sure that the metadata can't be made to match.
I think it could.
It doesn't actually have to be done upstream. Why couldn't that happen in transmission?
True. No, absolutely. Well, that would be similar to what we did with the production guys. We received agency stuff in, took care of it in the production studio before it went into automation, and then when it went downstream to the rest of the transmitters and everything else, it was where it should be. So yeah,
well, you raise a good point, and I think the networks have opened up about their program delivery specs. You can now easily access all of that from all of the major networks. of them, ABC, CBS, Fox, NBC, PBS, they're all available online. And they specify, so that there is no misinterpreting, they specify what the maximum true peak should be. They specify what the loudness should be, and that it is BS 1770-2 or -3. And the only difference between those, in case anybody is getting nervous, is that there's a difference in the way the true peak metering is done. It's actually leaving off some stuff that most of us left off anyway. So it's mostly a procedural change. It's not a change in how loudness is measured. But definitely between 1770-1 and -2, there was a change to how loudness is measured. But as long as you're using BS 1770, this is what COM gives the broadcaster. They can go back to the ad houses and say, I'm sorry, this isn't compliant. You either make it compliant or we're going to have to, but we can't air it this way. It's illegal for us to do it. So if COM has done one good thing, that's what I meant about the sharp point of the arrow. It's finally given broadcasters the ability to go back and say, this isn't right. And it's, even though COM actually only applies to commercial audio, right? The Commercial Audio Loudness Mitigation Act. The spirit of the rules says the audio shall be consistent. And so program delivery specs are being pushed back upstream for everybody that's delivering content. It's really in everybody's best interest to, as Chris was explaining, to have some consistency before it arrives at a station. But now they've got the courage, the stations, the networks have the courage and the backbone to stand up and say, nope, it's not right. Fix it or we will, or believe it or not, we're not going to air it. That's a tough thing to say about a Pepsi spot or a Coke spot or a Toyota spot. But
now you can, and it's no longer a subjective thing that the TV station is saying. It's look here. I'm sorry, it's not compliant. We can't air this, but you can fix it,
or we can,
Yeah. Tim, we have run plumb out of time. Is there any final thing you'd like us to know about what we've been talking about before we have to close the show out?
I don't mean to do an overt plug. But there is a good bit of information available on the web. Certainly ATSC.org. You can download a free copy of A85. There is a new version coming. It adds into it the latest ITU spec. Stay tuned. That's in process. It is just about to be released. There is a 5 or 6 page FAQ in that document. Sort of a get started quick guide that really summarizes the key points. The report and order, if you can handle it, is always worth looking at. And I would encourage people to visit the Linear Acoustic website. You can go to telosalliance.com and it'll direct you over, or you can go directly to linearacoustic.com. Really, if anybody has any questions, we're always here and we're always interested in talking to people. We, at all of Telos, we really believe in having a human being on the other side of the phone, and you can connect to other human beings like Kirk and I. And, we're in this for the long haul. At Linear, we really focus on digital television audio. We're not building video DAs or proc amps. We are focused on television audio. So if there's anything that we can do, we're happy to.
Tim, I'll put some links in the show notes that will go up on the gfqnetwork.com website and also on our own website, which is thisweekinradiotech.com, and those will be part of the show notes. So we'll link to Linear Acoustic. Are there some white papers or other forms of explanation there that folks could download?
Yep, there's there's an FAQ about COM. A lot of the stuff that's posted is meant as a technical education. I promise it's, unless you download a spec sheet, which is product specific, the tech notes are really about technical issues and are meant to be educational and less of a sales pitch. But there's a good bit to read. I think A85 will keep most people busy. It's a lengthy one.
I'll link to that too. I sure will. We got to go. It is, we've gone an hour and 15 minutes, and I have enjoyed every bit of it. I think I'm going to have to review a couple things to understand it better, and I'm going to go to the websites at atsc.org and get this 885 document. So we'll put that in the show notes as well. Tim, Carroll, thank you so much for taking time away from your family and being with us this evening. I appreciate it very, very much.
Kirk, thanks. I appreciate it. It's been a couple times that we've tried to get together on this, and I'm glad you were able to make the time. It's an interesting thing that you're doing here, and with 4 kids, I appreciate the break.
Well, yeah, there is that. Congratulations on the latest one. That's just awesome. Yeah. Hey, Chris Tobin, thank you for being with us here as well.
Yeah,
no problem. I enjoyed it. Really like I said, Tim's talk at the 30 Rockefeller Center at NBC with the SMPTE folks last year was quite enlightening, and actually hit the nerve with a few folks in the audience. And the gentleman from NBC, and I can't think of his name, was very particular about if the industry and the folks involved just paid attention, things could really work out, and everybody can enjoy the COM Act and not have to worry about that government person knocking at their door when somebody complains or a group of people complain. Yeah,
that was Jim Starzinski.
That's it, Jim. Yes.
Jim is the chair of the group S63, which is where A85 came from.
Oh, right.
Yeoman's work. A lot of arrows in the back. It's a tough haul. So yeah, Chris, thanks. You brought up some really good points. It's going to take a lot of thinking and a lot of work, but as long as we keep doing both, I think we'll get there.
Absolutely.
Gentlemen, thanks again. You have been watching or listening to This Week in Radio Tech, episode 151, with Tim Carroll. And if you like this show, you can certainly download it. You can watch it, and you can subscribe to the audio or video feeds by looking at the gfqnetwork.com website and finding this episode and clicking the appropriate links to either download, watch, or subscribe to the RSS feeds. Thanks a lot to Andrew Zarian at the GFQ Network for switching the show and helping us out quite a bit, always being there to make the show happen. And thanks again to Tim and to Chris Tobin. We'll be back next week with another episode of This Week in Radio Tech. Bye-bye, everyone.
That's all the bandwidth we can pill for this week. Another tort has propagated, and all the transmitters and audio equipment live happily ever after, thanks to the handsome engineer and his kind, benevolent care. We'll be back next week.
Lord willing and the creek don't rise.
This Week in Radio Tech.
Subscribe to iTunes and you'll never miss a show.
Search for This Week in Radio Tech in the iTunes Store. Soliciting is strictly encouraged. If you like today's show, tell a friend. If you didn't like it, we were never here.
Kirk Harnack's wardrobe provided by the Salvation Army and the Red Cross Disaster Relief Services. Hair and makeup provided by Penelope Garcia Hernandez Weinberg.
He's unique, wouldn't you say?
I just want to get it over with.
This ends this transmission.
Tango, Whiskey, India, Romeo, Tango.
Signing off. Okay.